Hi, welcome to episode 1 whoop, whoop, of the Global Grit Experience podcast. I am so thrilled and grateful you're here. For real. I'm so excited. I'm Erica, your host. This podcast is about grit, having passion and perseverance, among other powerful traits like innovation, creativity, determination, despite challenges we're faced with. And there are a lot of challenges out there right now, especially for the environment. But having grit can sound exhausting, right? Especially when we're pooped, worn out, overwhelmed, and perhaps just in the tank mental health-wise. So I thought it'd be good to kick off this podcast with what I think is top tier important, our mental health. Because without it, we burn out and drop out, and that's not good for you, for us, because we miss out on what you have to give, or for our precious outdoors, because we each have something to contribute, right? We're amazing! So I'm starting my podcast, episode 1, with a wonderful psychologist, Dr. Jonathan Aligada. Dr. Jonathan Aligada is an adult clinical psychologist at Sanford Health in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. I've interviewed Dr. Aligada before for a mental health video series, and I'm so grateful he's able to join us for this podcast. So let's begin. Hello, Dr. Jonathan Aligada. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Erica, thanks for having me.
Let's just dive right in because I'm so excited about what you have to share with us today. So things, as you know, are especially challenging in Minnesota and the world right now. Are you and your colleagues seeing an increase in anxiety and depression because of it? And if so, how is it showing up in people?
That's a great question. And I would certainly tell you from an anecdotal standpoint with my own practice, I certainly have seen an uptick in anxiety for people. And it predominantly, I think, seems to be more anxiety based. But again, that's just kind of my experience. And so, I think I've been telling people that, when I first started practice in 2009, societal and political stuff really wasn't part of the equation, or at least it didn't seem like it was much of what I did. But as years have gone by, and then certainly here in Minnesota in the past few weeks, months, it certainly has been more stressful for people. And again, I would say that it shows up quite a bit as anxiety and worry about the future. But again, I think it's important to frame that as that's my experience anecdotally. I have had some colleagues who had noted some similar dynamics. But if we wanted to ground it a little bit in a larger scope, although it's potentially a little bit more nuanced than maybe what we're having in Minnesota, but the APA has done a survey, I think ever since 2007, but the 2025 Stress in America survey certainly did point to societal division being an important stressor for people, and then certainly loneliness being a problem for people. And so to some degree, I think that I'm sure that depending on where you live and what your experience is, there's some nuances about the things that are bothering people, but it's also national. It's also maybe a larger factor in America right now that we're struggling with a sense of loneliness and disconnection overall in societal division. So that's not just my practice, it's other places too.
What was the reference you just made to
the American Psychological Association? I can't remember off the top of my head when it came out, but you certainly can search the APA's website and find it. It's the Stress in America survey. And so, for instance, what they have pointed out that 54% of adults feel isolated. And then of those who feel that societal division is a big factor, it's 61% feel isolated. And so I think they've done this survey for a good number of years. And over time, generally stress levels have maybe stayed the same, but it has taken maybe a little bit more of a tilt to societal division and loneliness.
Yeah, I feel that. Can you offer some general tips on how to help with this isolation, loneliness, and anxiety that comes with everything going on in the world?
Yeah, I would say, and I might want to just break out a couple of nuances here too. So, in general, just to kind of speak to that question there about loneliness, which again, maybe I can draw on another portion. Vivek Murthy, who's the previous Surgeon General under Obama and Biden, wrote a book called Together, which is really about loneliness being an epidemic. And, certainly there's some consideration that further on down the road, when we talk about division, that's really just maybe an outgrowth of that. It's just a way that particular stressors become even worse when underneath it all, we're feeling much more lonely. And, on some levels, I think that a first recommendation for that is to simply come together in groups and identify community and identify, what are your main interests, or if there are some things you would like to develop for yourself. If it's a health behavior routine or something like that, look for a group of people who do those things. And so work to join groups. I think joining groups was a lot easier back in the day. And I think if you listen to some sociologists like Robert Putnam, who would say that the advent of the TV and air conditioning has led us to be spending more time in our homes and not bonding and connecting with others. It certainly suggests that it's important for us to be more proactive in doing that. So whatever organizations and things that you think are really important in life, just finding a way to connect to those groups, I think is really important. And then work to just make that a priority in life and to frequent those kinds of events. I think that that's an easy recommendation, but I think that there's another element to this, especially when, as I mentioned in that APA survey, societal division is a big part of life right now. And polarization and division is probably fed by people following their interests very narrowly and then finding connection of those interests. So I realized I just said a moment ago, like find an interest and then build connection around it. And I still think that's true. But at the same time, I could also make the argument that it's important to stay connected with people who have some difference from us as well and foster connection that way. When we talk about political polarization, it's pretty standard that trying to argue your case and argue facts never really changes things. But developing friendships with people who are different than us and learning how to tolerate those differences and stay connected and basically see each other as human amongst those differences is also really important. And so I think that collectively we have to try to sort out, how do we maintain connection to people who we think reflect our values, but we also have to maintain connection to people who don't, and to stay connected to those people. And then I think that's probably a more robust strategy for people staying connected overall. So we might become more and more lonely when we really only can tolerate a smaller subset of people and situations that reflect us. And so we've got to have some nuance in our social relationships and dynamics, and develop things that are reflections of who we are, but also maintain some connection to people who we are maybe a little bit different than.
Well, that's great. I love hearing that perspective. What about being overwhelmed with news? We want to be informed, we want to stay informed, but is there a balance that we should try to maintain? Because I think that's a lot of my anxiety. I want to stay informed, but yet it can make me want to stay under my covers all day.
Well, it's a great question, and I think very understandable in today's climate, and also probably a lot harder to manage in today's climate. I'm old enough to remember when the news was on for an hour a day in the evening or something like that. Now, there's multiple opportunities to watch this news all day long through different avenues as well. There's TV, there's YouTube clips, there's social media feeds, and there's your news feed that you get on your phone. And so there's really no shortage of avenues at which all the scary stuff of the world gets to affect us. And so it becomes really important to have, and maybe I'll just coin this term, some news hygiene, that we think a little bit more intentionally and mindfully about the news we consume. So what I've been telling people is this, and then I'll tell you why it's maybe. Well, let me say a little bit first of why I think it's problematic. So number one, when we have as much news as we do, I think that it's tantamount to just chronic worrying. So if we just use a completely different example of somebody who's scared about a health condition that they might have, their brain is basically playing out catastrophic events about their health 24/7. And so they're ruminating and they're worrying on and on and on. And how we would understand that playing out in their mind is that a short-term stressor, which our minds were built for, flared up. But then because of worry and rumination and constantly focusing and fixating on it, their stress response just continues to fire repeatedly over and over and over again. And then they start to habituate to that level of distress, and their baseline almost becomes that level of distress. So that's when someone's stress response is chronically elevated. Now, I just think that the news cycle can effectively do that for a person who maybe didn't think that way previously, right? We have all these news stories kind of bombarding us over and over again. And then our minds become habituated to that level of distress over and over and over again, day in, day out. And then what new tragedy or situation can unfold tomorrow and the next day? And, it often feels like news cycles and social media algorithms are just kind of built that way to keep throwing negative stuff our direction. Well, essentially, people are just having news-induced worry chronically over and over and over again. And so when that's the case, one of the things that I think is just important to highlight from an awareness perspective is just kind of asking the question of, is this news really offering me something new? And qualitatively and meaningfully new to me as a person? Like, am I going to develop a new perspective or a response based on this news clip that I'm watching or listening to? And if it's not, then I think that it's really just functionally firing your nervous system over and over and over again. And so what I try to encourage people to do is, when you are going to watch the news to stay informed, which I think is important, I think it's important to reflect on, okay, as I'm watching this, is this actually new information, yes or no? And if it's not really new information, then I think it's important to kind of at least mark that in your mind. Okay, this is nothing new. There's nothing new to respond to in this moment. And then make a decision to turn it off or move on. If it is qualitatively new, well, what is the new thing that you need to know and respond to? What are you going to do meaningfully different? And if at the end of the day, you're just recycling and watching the same video clip, as an example, over and over and over and over again and perseverating on it, you're really just firing your nervous system over again and risking moving into this habituated state. You're losing what we call top-down control of, okay, this is not important, I'm going to put it away. And so that's one part I would say, is just really work to, be mindful of whether or not this is adding something new to you as a person. Maybe secondly, I'd have you ask the question of, is it really true that I need to be this informed to this level in order to feel like I know what's going on? I think on some levels, people can stay in this hypervigilant state and feel like I need to be here for some reason. And I don't even think they give themselves permission to say, actually, no, I don't have to be in this state to be informed or to be a responsible citizen. I would ask people to kind of challenge themselves on that level. And largely because chronically elevated stress states just keep you in kind of an unhealthy space where over time, it's not good for the system. And so it actually kind of works against oneself to be chronically elevated. And I just think that we sometimes don't really realize that. We sometimes think, I need to be this worked up because it's that bad. Well, it might be bad, but do you need to be that worked up? And I know that some people will even say, well, but to be calmed down seems wrong too. I understand and I can sympathize with that idea. It's just that at the end of the day, we know that elevated stress response is not good for your immune system. It's not good for your cardiovascular system. It's not good for pain perception. There's all these ways in which it's not good for your body. And so I think it's okay to step back and say, hey, look, this is also not good for me. I need to detach from it and just give yourself permission to not have to be in that state all of the time. So I would start off with that.
How about depression? What are signs you're clinically depressed? And in comparison, how would you handle if you're just really sad and you feel like going out with friends for lunch or, going to a movie or enjoying yourself is actually like what you just said? It's full of guilt because things are sad and you shouldn't be happy or relaxing or enjoying yourself.
Yeah. Let me take the first question, just about depression, and kind of sorting that out. So when we think about a quote unquote depressive episode, which is kind of what we use to determine whether or not somebody might meet criteria for clinical depression, you have to at least have two symptoms. One is anhedonia, which really translates to low motivation or a lack of pleasure in life. And then the second one is suppressed mood and affect. So just feeling sad and blue. Now, there's a handful of other symptoms that we want to see in addition, at least, 3 to 4 more: concentration, self-esteem, weight gain or loss, you know, physically feeling kind of fatigued and run down, suicidal thoughts. So when enough of those symptoms crop up, someone's probably having a depressive episode. And there's certainly a matter of degree that matters here as well. But it really becomes clinical when people are not doing things that are really meaningful in their life. So going to work, having healthy relationships, and it really feels like that person's mood is standing in between them and having a meaningful life of some kind. And so that's probably a moment to stop and think like, boy, am I not getting to work? Am I kind of withdrawing from social relationships because of how I feel, given the symptoms that I just mentioned? That's probably time to start thinking about getting some help clinically. And so the other question that you're getting at, though, I think, again, is it okay to engage in self-care when all these bad things are happening? And again, we want part of when we're living healthy lives, it's that we have a very responsive and flexible nervous system that can address what's happening in the here and now. When we have a nervous system that stays pretty rigidly focused on all the bad things that either are going to happen in the future or that happened in the past, we're not enjoying a very flexible nervous system. And so I try to think about it that way a little bit more so than happiness per se or feeling good and things like that. I mean, that is important. And if you have a very flexible nervous system, you probably are feeling that way. But we want to have a flexible system that might look into the future and say, hey, I need to do this thing to be prepared for something big that's happening. Or in the here and now, something important moment's going to happen in the here and now that I need to be responsive to. And if your nervous system is so locked into the fight or flight mode, and it can't step out of that and be flexible, that's where maybe big life choices have to be made, or some meaningful decisions have to be played out really well. And if we're not flexible enough, we will miss those moments. And so having some time where the nervous system is shifting out of this chronically elevated state is probably what's going to help you stay flexible. And so I don't always think about going to the movies, spending time with friends, or doing something that seems fun as being, like self-indulgent, if that's maybe the way that some people might think about it. I think about it as having your nervous system be capable of moving into different states flexibly. And if you're not getting that, it's kind of like when we think about having a well-rounded diet. Like, is it the worst thing to have candy? No, but you should probably be having some vegetables, some meats, proteins, whatever, right? Like, it should be varied. And your nervous system should experience varied states, not constant panic all the time. And so I try to sell it as not just go have fun in this kind of self-indulgent way. It's allow your nervous system to decompress, to disconnect from the stressors, and to have a flexible, rewarding life. If you can't do that, you might not be able to make the most of life and whatever decisions you need to make.
When so many people are feeling overwhelmed, how can you ask for help from friends and family when you know that they're also feeling overwhelmed with emotions and you just feel like maybe you don't have anybody to turn to?
Yeah, and then there's something interesting in the way that you just framed that question because you said, how do you ask for help? And if I hear that and maybe hear some possible interpretations of that, I think on some level, it's kind of hard for people to ask for help. And especially when maybe everybody else is feeling it as well, too. But that's interesting because it says we all are kind of needing help, me, you, everybody else. And so I would encourage people to think about social connection as being a form of medicine in these moments. And asking for help is kind of like asking to pull that social network in. But also, if other people are needing help, then you're having to be pulled in to be that sense of social medicine, right? So, what if maybe the frame of reference is it's not about me needing help or you needing help? We just kind of need to help each other stay afloat. And it's kind of like a raft with individual slats, right? When you tie them up well enough, they float together. If they kind of get unraveled, they're going to float away and sink or something like that. And so I would look at social connection as being both good for them and me at the same time. Maybe the question isn't about asking for help per se, it's just about devoting time to connecting. That itself is probably inherently helpful. I think there's some conditions to think about there that I'll add here, but I think at first, just let's not look at it as asking for help. Well, let's just look at it as bonding. And that itself is helpful. And so it's good for them, it's good for me. Let's just get together. Now, on top of that, part of what I would also add that I see from patients, and I think there's lots of other ways of kind of clarifying why this is true, but I think ultimately what helps people feel better is validating each other's experiences. And furthermore, like not trying to fix each other's feelings. And when we're wanting help from people, at least at this stage, there is a place where maybe professional help is warranted and that adds a little bit more of the picture. But when we're talking about just social connection, I think we're really just asking for people to validate our feelings. And so I think that if we kind of clarify that that's what we're about, like, how are you doing? Here's how I'm doing. And we just try to listen to each other and support each other and not try to fix each other's emotions. I think that typically is a pretty fair and helpful way of relating to each other. That takes care of a lot of heavy lifting. So again, if I just tie that up, I think part of it is just looking at bonding as inherently a good thing, whether you're asking or providing help. But then just make space for each other's thoughts and feelings about what's going on and try not to fix each other.
That's so powerful because going back to your isolation, I catch myself wanting to just stay home because I don't have anything to give. I don't have any positive, happy vibe to give. So I'd rather just stay home alone than share my sadness or negativity with other people.
That's a great point. And I can appreciate that. And to some degree, I would acknowledge that sometimes people feel like they don't want to be a burden or they don't want other people's burdens. But I sometimes think that's more of a reflection of what I think is people's unconscious attempts to just change each other's mood states. But saying like, well, I don't have anything to offer is kind of saying like, I need to make that other person happy. Like it's okay to not have to fix how somebody feels. And I think if we just can share space, that is a corrective in and of itself.
Can you share with our listeners any tips on how to stay emotionally and mentally in balance through trying times?
I would think about physically, how are you taking care of your physical health? Because Part of that chronic elevation can actually be helped out quite a bit by some of the cores of like sleep and exercise, diet too. And so getting good cardiovascular exercise actually helps people regulate down to a calmer state, because you're kind of stressing the stress response, but then the body adapts by bringing it down. Sleep, of course, seems pretty obvious, but it still bears stating. So if you're not getting a good night's rest, finding some ways to do that is important. Psychologically, I think that one thing to think about is, especially in this day and age, is what are your values? And then trying to articulate, how do you see your values into action? So sometimes I might ask a person to think about, if there's a virtue that you associate with yourself, not that there is only one, there might be more, but just take one as an example. Well, what would that virtue do in this day and age? So if you consider yourself a very loving person, well, what does that virtue do in this current moment? So if you're thinking about a specific social problem that you have a hard time wrapping your mind around, well, what would be the most loving thing to do, or loyal, or whatever that value or virtue you think stands in for you? Try to think through life in those terms, and then try to find the actions and behaviors that go with that. I think it's pretty easy with the news to get overwhelmed and just get paralyzed and not do anything. But kind of like we're talking about the news, I would say try to limit your exposure to it. And then like we were saying before, be intentional about what you consume. Again, it's kind of like a diet. You can't just eat junk food all day long. And so what are you going to do on a meaningful level? How much do you corral? How much news you take in? Be mindful of the things that stress your system. Find ways to limit them, but also develop meaningful responses to them. And then the other thing that I would say is, back to the social part, develop healthy, strong social networks and work on regular bonding with those people, getting together, creating some kind of ritual that creates space for everybody to be together. And it doesn't always have to be around the negative stuff. Sometimes it'll be around the positive stuff, but make space for the negative stuff too. I think that collectively, there are some reciprocal benefits to strong social ties. So I think about those buckets: keep your body healthy, keep your mind healthy, keep your relationships healthy.
That was wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to share with listeners before we go?
I would just stress the values part. As a psychologist working with individuals, that's the thing that I really come back to, is life has always been somewhat precarious. If you go back to cavemen, it's always been under threat. We've always had some levels of insecurity, but maintaining a valued set of behaviors and relationships, I think, is probably paramount. So as much as you can do that, so much the better.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Aligada. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. My honor. My pleasure.
That was Dr. Jonathan Aligada from Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. I hope you liked what he shared as much as I did. Thank you again, Dr. Aligada, and thank you all for joining episode 1 of the Global Grid Experience that you're now officially a part of. Whoop whoop! I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what you think, and if you have any topic ideas you'd like to hear about or guests you'd like to suggest, you can check out the Global Grid Experience on Instagram, Facebook, and find more episodes coming soon wherever you like to listen to podcasts, or go to theglobalgridexperience.com. Thank you. Talk soon.